Imagine sitting in a wooden box with no engine, waiting for a plane to fly over you at 130 miles per hour and hook you into the sky. This was the only way out of a hidden valley that the rest of the world did not even know existed. For 47 days, 3 survivors of a horrific plane crash had to navigate a world that seemed frozen in time, surrounded by a tribe that believed they were spirits from another world. This is the story of the Gremlin Special. The story begins on May 13, 1945, which was Mother's Day. At Base G in Hollandia, Dutch New Guinea, spirits were high as the war in Europe had just ended only days before. Personnel were looking for a way to relax, and an unofficial sightseeing flight was organized. The aircraft was a Douglas C-47 Skytrain, nicknamed the Gremlin Special. On board were 24 people, including 5 crew members and 19 passengers. Among them was Corporal Margaret Hastings, a member of the Women's Army Corps. She was joined by other WACs and soldiers who were eager to see the fabled hidden valley that pilots had been whispering about for months. The flight was meant to be a simple loop over the Baliem Valley, a place so remote and surrounded by 4,000-meter peaks that it was effectively cut off from the rest of civilization. The pilot was Colonel Peter Prosson. As they entered a narrow mountain pass, the atmosphere inside the plane was social. Some reports indicate that Colonel Prosson had actually left the cockpit to chat with the passengers, leaving a less experienced co-pilot at the controls. Suddenly, the plane hit a powerful downdraft. In the thin mountain air, the C-47 lost lift rapidly. The pilots struggled to regain control, but they were trapped in a narrow valley with nowhere to turn. The Gremlin Special slammed into the side of a mountain at full speed. The impact was catastrophic, tearing the plane apart and sending a fireball through the fuselage. Of the 24 people on board, only 5 initially survived the crash. Lieutenant John McCollum was miraculously uninjured. He crawled out of the wreckage to find a scene of absolute horror. Among the survivors were Margaret Hastings and Sergeant Kenneth Decker, both of whom were badly burned and wounded. 2 other WACs, Eleanor Hanna and Laura Bisley, also survived the initial impact. However, their injuries were severe. The survivors huddled together near the wreckage as the sun began to set over the peaks, leaving them in a cold, damp darkness. The first night was a test of endurance. They were at a high altitude, and the tropical heat of the day vanished, replaced by a biting chill. By the next morning, the tragedy deepened when both Eleanor Hanna and Laura Bisley succumbed to their wounds. John McCollum knew they couldn't stay at the crash site. The wreckage was hidden under the jungle canopy, making it nearly impossible for search planes to find them. He convinced Margaret and Kenneth that they had to move toward a clearing. They eventually reached a ridge that offered a view of the valley floor below. What they saw was breathtaking. It was a patchwork of cultivated fields and stone-walled villages. They had found the hidden world of the Dani people. While they were amazed, they were also terrified. At the time, rumors of cannibalism among the tribes of New Guinea were common. The survivors did not know if the people below would be their saviors or their executioners. Back at Base G, the Gremlin Special was declared missing. Search planes were scrambled, but the terrain was so vast and the maps so inaccurate that finding a single downed plane was like looking for a needle in a haystack. It wasn't until May 17th, 4 days after the crash, that a search pilot spotted something unusual. He saw the flash of a signal mirror and then the 3 survivors standing in a small clearing near the crash site. The discovery sparked a massive relief effort, but the problem was how to get them out. The valley was surrounded by mountains so high that no rescue plane could land and take off again. Parachuting in was the only way to reach them. On May 26th, 2 paratrooper medics, Sergeant Doc Buletow and Corporal Rami Ramirez, jumped into the valley. They were members of the 1st Filipino Regiment and were chosen for their toughness and medical expertise. When the medics reached the survivors, they were shocked by their condition. Margaret Hastings had severe degree burns on her legs that had become infested with maggots. Without immediate care, she would have lost her limbs or her life. A few days later, on June 1st, a larger team of 10 paratroopers led by Captain Cecil Earl Walter Jr. jumped in. Their mission was to establish a base camp and protect the survivors while a rescue plan was devised. As the military presence grew, the local Dani people began to approach. They had never seen white people before, nor had they seen clothing, metal, or aircraft. They believed the survivors were spirits descending from the heavens. This interaction was fueled by an ancient prophecy. The Dani believed that one day light-skinned spirits would arrive, signaling a time of great change. To them, the arrival of the parachutists was the fulfillment of this legend. To keep the peace, the Americans traded cowrie shells, which were dropped by supply planes, for fresh food. The shells were a form of currency for the Dani, and this trade ensured the camp was well supplied with sweet potatoes and pigs. The paratroopers were even given a small pig by the tribe. They named the pig Peggy after Margaret Hastings. It became the camp mascot, a strange bit of levity in a situation that remained incredibly dangerous. While the world followed the story through radio updates, a cinematographer named Alexander Can was actually parachuted into the valley. His job was to film the entire ordeal for newsreels and military propaganda. The press nicknamed the location Shangri-La, after the fictional paradise in the novel Lost Horizon. Margaret Hastings became a media sensation, dubbed the Queen of Shangri-La by journalists who romanticized the grueling survival situation. Despite the media's portrayal of a tropical paradise, the reality was much grimmer. The survivors were still in a high-altitude jungle, suffering from infections, trauma, and the constant fear that the rescue might never come. The survivors spent a total of 47 days in the valley. Every day, the military brass debated how to get them out. The mountains were too steep for a traditional takeoff, and the jungle was too thick for a rescue trek. The solution they eventually settled on was as brilliant as it was terrifying: the glider snatch pickup. It involved landing a glider in the valley and then using a low-flying plane to hook it and pull it into the air. A Waco CG-4A glider, made of wood and canvas, was towed into the valley and released. It glided down and landed on a strip of ground that the paratroopers and Dani people had cleared by hand. Once the glider was on the ground, the real challenge began. To get it back into the air, they had to set up two 15-foot poles with a nylon loop suspended between them. This loop was connected to the glider's tow rope. A C-47 transport plane would then fly over the clearing at an altitude of only 20 feet. A long steel hook dangling from the tail of the plane would have to snag the nylon loop at 130 miles per hour. The physics were daunting. To prevent the rope from snapping and the passengers' necks from breaking, an automatic winch inside the C-47 would pay out steel cable, gradually slowing the acceleration. Even with the winch, the survivors would be jerked from a standstill to over 100 miles per hour in just a few seconds. It was a maneuver that had rarely been tested with live passengers, let alone injured ones. On June 28th, the rescue operation finally began. The 3 survivors were the first to be evacuated. As the C-47 roared toward the clearing, everyone on the ground held their breath. The hook hit the loop perfectly. With a deafening crack, the glider was yanked forward. It shot across the grass and lifted into the air, trailing behind the transport plane like a kite on a string. Inside the glider, the survivors felt a crushing force as they were pinned against their seats. But within moments, They were soaring over the jagged peaks that had imprisoned them for nearly 7 weeks. It took 3 separate glider trips throughout the day to evacuate everyone, including the paratroopers and the journalist Alexander Can. The complex operation was a total success, with no further injuries or loss of life. When they arrived back at Hollandia, they were greeted as heroes. Margaret Hastings, in particular, was thrust into a world of flashbulbs and microphones. The story of the whack in the hidden valley was exactly what a war-weary public needed. She was sent on a tour across the United States to sell war bonds. To the public, she was the brave queen of Shangri-La, but privately she was struggling with the memories of her friends who didn't make it off that mountain. John McCallum and Kenneth Decker also returned to their lives, though they were forever changed by the experience. The valley, once a place of myth and legend, was now a fixed point on the military maps. Years later, researchers would find that some of the details reported by the press were slightly off. The exact coordinates of the crash site were kilometers away from where official records placed them. The story of the Gremlin Special remains one of the most remarkable survival tales in history. It was a collision of 2 worlds, the height of 1940s technology and a culture that had remained unchanged for thousands of years. The survivors left the valley, but the valley never truly left them. They were the last people to see Shangri-La before the modern world finally caught up to it. The rescue from Shangri-La stands as a testament to human ingenuity and the unexpected bonds that can form in the most extreme circumstances. Subscribe for more interesting stories.